What's up, everybody, and welcome to another dojo container from the container of the Broom Radio. The Broom Radio is a podcast and a spiritual community which takes place within a Discord server called The Broom, and you can find out more information about joining at thebroom.us. The container of dojo is a container which is basically a place where we invite people from our communities inside and outside the broom to talk about the process of spiritual expansion on individual and collective levels. And today I'm with Leah Prime, or Leah Prime on X, and I'm really excited to see what comes up in this container. How you doing, Leah? Do you want to say a little bit about yourself and I guess what's coming up around your association with people you know in the broom?
hmm Sure. Yeah. So I have, I've become, I would say, almost like an ancillary participant in the Broom over the last year or so. Not very much directly, but befriending and talking to a lot of people who are present in this community. And I think for me, what I've always found incredibly rewarding is talking to people that have like very expansive perceptions and practices around spirituality, and who are also able to see uh, not quite universal, but like consistent themes and emergent properties of different kinds of spirituality and practices. Um, and so that's my very nice way of saying I'm super excited to talk to you. And as I said before we began recording, it's a rare opportunity for me to talk about ufology with people who are also spiritually aware and active. And that's it's not contained in any one thing, but my approach to the subject and interest in it is largely through the lens of spirituality and spiritual experiences. Because the kind of like material side of UFO stuff isn't very compelling to me. I'm not very interested in crash retrievals or advanced aircraft. I'm interested in experiencer phenomena, right? People who have claimed or purported to engage with non-human intelligence, and sort of the constellation of things that come with that, like synchronicities and spiritual emergence and awakenings, and how these ideas show up and are metabolized by people, and made sense of.
Yeah, that's so well said for me. Thank you for prepping the container in that way. I also want to say that we have a couple of people from the broom with us here live, and I trust y'all to chime in intuitively. Um, and yeah, I guess like the way this container kind of came up in my field was, I'm not sure when people will be listening to this, but I would say in the last like month or 2 months, especially, like from my perspective of the collective consciousness and how it manifests in material reality. The last, like couple of months, we've seen, I guess, like more reports of, well, now people are calling them drones, right? But I think when the
Yes.
reports first started like coming out en masse, people were calling them UFOs or UAPs. And as soon as that started happening, like like little parts on the edge of my field on the periphery start kind of jangling, and I was kind of like, I felt like I was sort of reaching out to you in the ether because
Yes.
I also, well, I'll say like I know you mostly as a spiritual practitioner, and then you have a UFO emoji usually like in your handle somewhere, and I know that you're on the periphery of the spiritual realm in a way that interfaces with like ufology circles. And as I was saying before we started recording, it's like really hard for me to tell like what's my bubble without understanding what's outside my bubble. I feel like
Yes.
in the material realm nowadays, it's actually harder and harder to figure out what's outside your bubble, apart from, quote, normative society, unquote. And
Yes.
yeah, like as soon as you start talking about like your experiences in ufology circles versus like your experiences with spiritual circles. A lot of stuff lit up for me. So I guess like I'd be kind of curious to hear about how you sort of like started walking the spiritual path and how you started becoming aware of ufology as a social phenomenon, I suppose.
Yes,
And
it's
yeah,
a
what's it been like to, yeah,
yes.
walk that.
It's a wonderful question. And I think I've become a lot of people's like de facto bullshit detector when it comes to ufology, right? Like I get lots of questions from people who I know and trust about, how seriously or what should I be making of the current flap. And we are definitely in the middle of a UFO flap. Yeah, that's sort of I don't know, that's like the journalistic uh, term for it, where you have, and there have been flaps all throughout modernity. Even starting, I mean, you could even arguably say like the visions at Fatima were a UFO flap, right? Because people reported mass sightings of seeing a miraculous event in the sky, and this is like in
Mm,
1919. Um,
mm,
and the current flap that we're in was really initiated in 2017 with an article that was published in the New York Times by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal. And this article was very much aligned with a major portion of the ufology world, which is the world of black operations and the military and the sort of conspiracy side of things. And this article basically contended that there is lots of money and lots of secretive Pentagon programs that have been dedicated and allocated to understanding and investigating unexplained anomalous phenomena, or UAP, which is kind of I don't know, I don't want to say the woke branding of a UFO, but they use UAP and USO to
mm.
now is the language to talk about aerial phenomena and then submersible phenomena, so unknown and unexplained phenomena that are encountered underwater. Um, and and the UFO subject for me is lifelong. I was just telling a friend of mine that I can remember saving my money when I was 8 or 9 years old and going to Borders Books and Music to buy UFO magazine. And I used to call the Alan J. Hynek hotline. So Alan Hynek was a big UFO guy in the 60s and 70s. There was a hotline that you could call and get sort of up to date information about what was going on in ufology. So I used to sneak my parents' portable telephone and call this long distance number. And I'm totally giving away how old I am right now talking about hotlines and calling long distance. Um, and this was deeply formative. And the other deeply formative thing, which I post a ton about, is Art Bell. I grew up listening to Coast AM. So this is sort of the prodrome period, my childhood and adolescence, this prodrome of my current interest. And
Mm.
I was in in 2020. I will close the loop on this or sort of connect it, but I'm going to shift lanes a little bit. In 2016, I read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time, and
Mm.
like many neurotic Jewish intellectuals, the Bhagavad Gita spoke a lot to me, and Vedic texts spoke a lot to me. And this kind of turned into a dedication both to Vedanta and also some exploration of Western esoteric and occult traditions. And ultimately, like where I am now is I would call myself just a Dharma practitioner, both in Buddhism and Vedic practice. But I had what I now would characterize as an experience of spiritual emergence in 2021. And this was spontaneous. It was not intentionally induced. It was completely sober, like no psychedelics, no breath work. Nothing really was involved in it, except, I guess, the tried and true combination of lots of meditation, lots of yoga, And for me, as anyone who follows me on Twitter probably recognizes, nature. I'm very eco-spiritual. Being in nature for me is very much an intensely spiritually charged experience. So I had this experience with emergence, and it well, it did all of the things that a classic spiritual emergence does, which is it completely blew my life up. Um, I quit my job, I left my boyfriend, I packed all my things into a storage unit, and I decided that I was just going to take some time and figure things out and spend time in this kind of expansive state. Um, and I think I always think of that line about like better not to start, but once started, better to finish, right? Like I was not doing the Dharma. First, I started doing the Dharma, and then the Dharma started doing me. And um, as I was getting deeper into this practice, I also had this sidecar interest in UFOs, and it was becoming very clear to me that experience or phenomena, so like self-reported experiences from people, so not from the government, not from the military, but things that people were talking about seeing or experiencing were very, very much under the purview of what I would characterize as spiritual experiences, but they were kind of linguistically coded in X-Files language, right? Rather than Dharmic language or Vedic language, they were coded in X-Files language. And
Mm.
and that was sort of what brought me to my current interest. And my interest in ufology is, nobody ever seems to believe me when I say this, but like I have basically zero interest in like government conspiracies or crash retrieval or UFOs as physical phenomena, like literal nuts and bolts craft. I'm very interested in how people self-report and metabolize and socialize these very powerful personal experiences they have, and also how
Mm.
they connect those experiences to UFOs. Because to me, that's not an intuitive jump to make. Like, it is not an intuitive leap for me to have some kind of anomalous phenomena occur and think this is a UFO or this is a function of an encounter with an alien being. And
Mm.
that's sort of what leads people to making that jumping to that conclusion is something I've really been exploring a lot. And um, I'm friends with and very close with a number of people who would describe themselves as experiencers, like people who claim or who have had very personal and intense encounters with what they characterize as non-human intelligence.
Mm. Yeah. Um, I mean, there's so many things that I want to kind of like trace from what you said, but I guess like starting from the end, when you talk about experiencers, I don't pronounce
Yes.
ours properly. I'm antipodean, but um, would you say that they experience those things as like materialized, like physical, or outside of their own, I guess, minds, or is it mostly
That's
internal? Or both? Or yeah, I mean, are they kind of phenomenologists? So like they don't believe that anything happens outside their minds or anyone's mind? Like how does that work in that field, I suppose?
Oh gosh. I'm going to be very cynical and say that most self-described UFO people would like never talk about phenomenology. This is like a much, frankly, a more sophisticated idea than I think you commonly see in like popular discourse on the subject. I would say that you it's usually a yes but or a no however situation. Um, I would say the most common experience for that I have seen with people or encountered in my own practices are non-physical. These are things like the term you'll frequently hear is like a download, which in Dharma practice we might call like you may assign it to like a particular meditative state or an awakening or an epiphany of some kind. And these are and downloads can be everything from this helped, I received a download and it helped me solve a complex math problem to I received a download and it told me I don't know, that I should go to Costco tomorrow because protein shakes are going to be on sale, right? It ranges from the incredibly complex and robust to like very quotidian. But you do also have on the periphery of this, you do have crossovers into the material plane, so like physical phenomena. And this is something like Whitley Strieber, who's kind of an icon in ufology. He wrote the book Communion, which is really what um, in popular imagination, I think, is characterized as like a UFO abduction book. But if you actually read this book, it is a spiritual emergence book. He doesn't talk about aliens. He doesn't talk about craft. He talks about these sort of numinous encounters that he has over a series of nights and events in upstate New York. And he has always claimed that he has implants, like that he has received alien implants or implants of a extraterrestrial or anomalous origin. And you will also hear some experiencers talk about physical marks that they have after their encounters or after their experiences. Um, what I will say, and I always feel I would say this about any subject that is not like strictly uh, empirical or scientific in our
Mm,
current paradigm. When I talk about these subjects, uh, I'm not necessarily endorsing what I'm saying. So, in other words, we're all grown-ups with functional intellects, which means we can talk about and say things that we don't necessarily agree with or think are true. And I say
mm,
that because um, I find the entire subject of ufology to fall under that purview, where I can talk about it and explore it, but I don't necessarily like. I find that many of these ideas, frankly, much like many of the ideas I encounter in my personal practice and meditation, is well outside the binary of true and false. It kind of exists in this like interstitial third place that is maybe like the myth realm or the folklore realm or the archetype realm that is
mm,
very
mm,
much divested of the compulsion to label things as true or false.
mm. Yeah, I feel like what's coming up for me is uh, something that I talk about quite often, which is like the illusion of objectivity, right? I think
Yes.
like the word truth has this like really interesting, I'll call it like shape as an egregore to
Hmm.
me, because that like you have like like I'd say anything that is spoken, anything which is associated with like logos or like words is egregoric, but like you have the egregoric use of like, like this is my
Yes.
truth, and then you have the egregore of scientific truth. And when you say that you kind of, yeah, like I'll say, apprehend a lot of what comes up in your experience and your experience of other people's experiences as being outside of that dialectic of true and false. I feel like what comes up for me, like Gnostically,
Yes.
is, yeah, I'd say like a pretty interesting, intuitive grasp of like, I'll say the interconnectivity of experience. And
Yes.
it feels
Yes.
like maybe that's a decent segue for me to talk about like my apprehension of your epistemic foundations and my apprehension of my own epistemic foundations in the reflection, or yeah, like in the container which includes my apprehension of your epistemic foundations. Like I'll probably get like a little bit more woo when I talk about it, but like the way that your epistemic foundations land in my field symbolically is as like, yeah, I would say like, and like sometimes people talk about this like as being like quote mythopoetic unquote, but like I'm kind of seeing like the foundations of like an oil rig maybe constructed out of something which looks like adamantium and also is not necessarily like connected to the ground in a way which is static, right? So it's like there's like a mechanism to it which I think allows you to yeah, I'll say like span um, some interesting shifts in your own experience, and also the gap between your experience and the experiences of many of like what I would call like your quote healed ancestors unquote in the earth.
Mm,
And then yeah, like your experiences of the experiences of people who have a wide range of yeah, there's many different types of epistemic foundations
yes.
in the field of experience that I feel like you're encountering, some of which I would call like vaporware. Um,
Yes.
but by contrast, I would say like my epistemic foundations feel a little bit more like um, molten lava being cooled in the ocean from undersea volcanoes. So I
Yes.
think the encounter of our little, I guess like our buoys kind of like floating in the ocean of collective experience as being attached to these different epistemic foundations is really fascinating to me. And I guess like from there, I'll take a little bit of a leap with the aid of your epistemic foundations or their anchoring in collective experience and say that like I don't think I was aware in the material realm that you have a connection to like I'll say either Judaism or Jewishness. And if you're okay with me taking that leap, I would ask, yeah, like how does that
Sure.
connect to um, your spiritual practice and your adventures in ufology?
Yes. Oh man. It's it's a first of all, what you just said is beautiful, right? Like I'm sitting on my meditation cushion right now with my eyes closed, listening to the language you use to weave this together. Um, and I so appreciate the imagery you drew forth. It's um my relationship to Judaism, I want to say it's complex, but it's really not. And I say that as uh, I am not observant in any meaningful sense. I do not practice. I do not go to synagogue. I do not keep kosher. I do not engage in the theology of Judaism. It's something that, very honestly, I'm quite alienated from in many respects. Um, but what I will say, I was raised in a very observant Jewish household. I was raised kosher. I was raised observing Shabbat. So like we walked to synagogue every Saturday. I had a very classic Hebrew education when I was
Wow.
younger. And my relationship to Judaism became real in my 20s. And I say this because it was the first time I could encounter my Jewishness in a way that made sense to me, and that was through the lens of the Jewish workers' movements and studying Yiddish. And this is a much more right. This is not spiritual. This is like the creation of labor unions at the turn of the century, and that the Jews were leading the charge on this and leading the charge on workers' rights in the 20th century, the early 20th century. And so I studied Yiddish. One of the things that captivated me about Yiddish is that, and I am of Ashkenazi Jewish extraction. Like half of my family is Roman Catholic from Lithuania, and half of my family is Jewish from Lithuania. So um, I am of Baltic extraction ultimately. Um, but what is very interesting in Judaism is that Hebrew was very much the language of scholasticism and study, and it was the language really for men to study the Torah and the Tanakh and to argue and debate. And like Judaism, if nothing else, is a powerful set of scaffolds or rules to sort of guide one's life. And in many respects, my experience with Judaism was it was non-dogmatic. So you follow these rules, but no one was telling me how to think or even what to think. It was just okay. These are these things you do, these rituals, and uh, you have Hebrew being spoken by the educated men, and then you have Yiddish, and Yiddish would be referred to as Mamaloshin, like the mother language. And this was the language of women. It was the language of the home, and this was the language of myth and folklore. Like this was the vernacular. So when you look back at 18th and 19th century Jews from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, um, the you had you had Yiddish as being what was used to convey these sort of mythologies and these folk tales, like the stories of the golem, or stories about the Dybbuk, which is the spirit that would inhabit a body that was left unattended before burial. There's some
Wow.
great German expressionist movies from the 20s about the Dybbuk and the golem. Um, and I think of that side of Judaism as much more relatable to me, right, than this sort of high scholasticism of arguing about some arcane passage in Leviticus or Deuteronomy. Like I see the kind of earthiness of Yiddish and folklore and the living language because it is very much a language that was emergent and dynamic and very much reflected both its time and its place. Like the Yiddish that my family spoke in Lithuania is very different than the Yiddish that was spoken in the Pale or in Ukraine or in Central Europe. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I think of my in a way I think of Judaism in my current spiritual practice as a beautiful artifact that I admire, but much like an artifact, it rests very nicely on a shelf and is not part of my actual lived spiritual practice.
Mm. Yeah, and I get the sense, yes, metaphysically and physically, that your shelves are very well stocked.
Yeah, I'm a collector, man. I have an insatiable appetite for experience, no matter what the experience is good or bad or anything. Um,
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I see you book post as well on X.com, and yeah, like I have this like, I feel very strong affinity with yeah, like Gnostically again, like stuff that you're reaching into, and also like a lot of what you articulate. But I'm kind of at the other end of the spectrum. Like I spent a lot of my time being a very avid reader, and
mhm,
now, I mean, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been pulled away from that method of engaging with consensus reality, I guess. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting to me to like hold that affinity and also like that difference in methods of engaging with consensus reality in the same awareness. But I definitely feel like it 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 aligns with, I guess, what I've been talking about with regard to our respective like methods of understanding what is quote real unquote. And I guess like what I'll add to that is that yeah, my own experiences with, I'll say, like the the metaphysical, I'll call it like the sky lineage of Jewishness,
mhm.
pretty wacky. Like I have dreams.
Sure.
I have dreams involving like especially Orthodox Jews all the time. I would say
Mhm.
that there's a lineage which I've felt very connected to for a while, which I also know Intrepid Bodies is connected to, which I'd say like we call secret as in SKRT, which I feel like is heavily anchored in the experiences of many people who I would say like are like deeply engaged with the tradition of halakha.
Mhm.
And I guess the reason I feel like I'm drawing this out of the miasma of this container is because you spoke to like yeah, like the dialectic of this like earthiness of Yiddish and I'll say like the culture which is like bound to Yiddish of Jewishness.
Mhm.
And then I think you also spoke to your relationship with the part of Jewish culture which is bound to like Hebrew. And
Yes.
I'll say that like I've had the honor of working with many Jewish practitioners of many different lineages of Judaism, and I feel like I can talk about how at least a few of them have spoken to the tradition of halakha as like an arbitration of like virtual reality or a virtual reality. Um, and I feel like it sits really nicely with what you're saying about, I'll say like the transmission of the lineage of Yiddish
Hmm.
Jewish. Um, and yeah, I mean, I feel like the way I apprehend it as an outsider is as like a training program in the manipulating and like I'm feeling like it's like this container is well contained enough to use a word like that, but like working with symbols, which I feel like is
Hmm.
I mean it less in the conspiracy sense and more in the computer science sense.
Right.
And I would also say using symbols to compare perspectives of reality and come to agreements about how we are going to negotiate conflicts in reality and also come to agreements about what we don't have to agree upon. And I
Yes.
feel like even if maybe your lived experience with that's like I want to call like a side of Jewishness is not necessarily as I'll say like reinforced in like your material experience as like Yiddish Jewishness. I would say if I feel like it contributes in like really positive ways to my sense of your epistemic foundations, which I feel is a kind of interesting thing to say. But I'm really glad that those epistemic foundations are in like the building. So I guess like with that said, I'm kind of like scrying the container a little bit and feeling into yeah, like what I'm gonna sort of like wiggle free a little bit and yeah, I'll say like I want to hold space for any of like your own experiences, like anything you want to articulate about your own experiences or experiences that you've held space for with regard to yeah, I'll say like downloads regarding the relationship between if I say like earth lineages, do you know what I mean? Like I'll say like doctrine-based religions.
Yeah,
Um,
like structured lineages.
yeah, I feel like you're gesturing at the same thing that I'm gesturing at with different words, and yeah, like I'm satisfied. Um, but yeah, like I'd love to hear you talk about downloads relating to the relationship between yeah, structured religions, earth lineages, and I'll say extraterrestrial intelligence.
Oh man, this is a huge subject, and this is I'm I'm gonna start by answering in a way that may not seem directly relevant, but I will get there, I promise. One of the things I was reflecting on recently is I have it. How do I put this? The personal spiritual practices of mine are I almost think of them as like intuitive folk practices. And I say that because what makes up my spiritual practice and my ritual working, is informed by um, these structural lineages. It's informed by, say, Vajrayana or non-dual Shaivism, or to some extent, I suppose, Judaism. Um, but these practices are like my knowledge of them is entirely propositional, or excuse me, entirely participatory. Like,
Mm,
whereas I think I have this far-reaching intellectual propositional knowledge of lineages, but um, my actual practices feel very far afield from them. And what I mean by this really is that I it took me a long time to make the connection between, oh, I read all these occult books and I read all these books about practice, and but I don't ever actually really do the practices that are in the books. And it kind of took me a while to make the connection between, oh, this is something you can actually do. Like, like this is not something I can kind of intellectually and voyeuristically watch or observe through these texts. I can actually do them. And I would say, like, my Dharma knowledge, like my Buddhist practice, for instance, is not textual. Like I have read very little of like canon, like the Pali Canon, and very little when it comes to, commentary and discourses, but it is it is the practice that I know best from
Mm,
a personal experience,
mm,
and has very little mapping back to a formal lineage. And I would even characterize most of my practices as being driven by, we can use the word downloads or inspiration. Sometimes I'll just kind of use the blanket term encounters with the numinous, right? Like it
mm,
is the call's coming from outside the house, and it is telling me what to do. Um, and it tends to be very intuitively driven, um, without adhering to or relying upon, these formalized practices or initiations. And this is something I will also add, something that I'm kind of trying to change. Like when I think about the the trajectory of my spiritual path, I it's kind of like dating. It's like I turned 30 and I was like, I am ready to commit. So here I am, maybe 8 years into my practice, my serious practice, and I am ready to commit in the sense that I would love to find and inhabit a lineage or scaffold, that would bring some kind of formalized structure, and guidance, right? Um, and I think there's always this tension to any serious practitioner between, um, what you do on your own and what you do with a group, and then what you do with a teacher. Um,
mm.
and the sort of movement between those three spaces is something that right now I would say is almost at the forefront of how I kind of the meta considerations that I have around spiritual practice.
Hmm. I'm just like, well, I feel like I'm crawling across some of the ladders you laid down there. But
Like
I
this
guess
is
like
this is
the
a lot. Like we are covering big ground here, Nobu.
I know I'm like how are we going to well, I'd say that like parts of me are like how are we gonna weave this all together and then, like the dominant part of me, which I sometimes refer to as my vaster self, is just like you don't have to, right? Like
Yes.
people who are listening, who will listen, are probably going to like crawl across the same ladders because I feel like probably a lot of them can relate to what you've laid down about your experience and how it, yeah, I'd say like coheres and does not cohere with quote formal practice unquote. And yeah, I'm really glad that you kind of ushered Vajrayana into the building because I'd say like I have like earth ancestral connections, which is to say that like the spirits that I'm connected to via genetic material, DNA, have a decent amount of acquaintance with Buddhism. I wouldn't say
Hmm.
that most of them have acquaintance with formal or doctrine-ex Vajrayana, but I would say that even more of them, and I'd say like the ones who are suspicious of Buddhism as an earth lineage, have had
Hmm.
I'll say like Vajrayana-esque connection with the numinous, which I would just basically describe as yeah, having like the courage to work with anthropomorphized articulations of the one,
Hmm.
which is,
Yes.
you know, basically allowing yourself to be possessed by fragments of divinity. Um,
Yes.
so I guess like leads me to the question which I thought I was going to ask 2 minutes ago when I started monologuing obnoxiously as I am now. But where do you feel like your downloads come from?
That's that's a great question. I can tell you where they don't come from. And I say this because so many so many people who have shared their practices with me talk about spiritual guides or holy guardian angels, these
Mm,
experiences of having like an accompanier. I do not have that. I've never had that. Like this is something that I partly envy in other people, um, and also partly cannot relate to. I have never felt the sense that there is a discrete other accompanying me or guiding me. Um, and instead, I the it's so hard to wrap language about these ideas. Um, or like when I think of the download experience and like this is actually kind of tongue in cheek. Like one of the most ironic things to me about downloads is that for me they show up as spiritual experiences, which I'll get to in a moment, but they also show up as very practical. Like and I say that because like I've started and run literally two successful businesses basically based off
mm,
of downloads. Like
wow.
I'm like leave it to me to like have the freaking download that's like this is how you build an Excel sheet and this is what you do with it. Like what kind of cosmic like gnosis is that? That's like there's a lot to unpack there about like what leads that kind of experience. Um,
Mm,
but I think of I almost think of how I conceptualize it to put words around it is I think of my spiritual practice as a grand tapestry that is woven with so many different threads. And each thread is kind of a self-contained energy or force or archetype. So if I talk about, like a working, let's say with Hecate, right? Like this is not a guide that I work with regularly, but I bring this up. Like my conception of Hecate is not as a person; it is as a force or an energy. And I think of downloads as cognitive, for lack of a better term, like cognitive experiences where information or decisions or solutions avail themselves often spontaneously and often in situations where my mind is otherwise quiet. So when I'm not on Twitter, um, but I also feel an embodiment of these energies when I undertake particular practices. Um, I feel, and again, this maps very heavily back to, I would say, the eco-spiritual side of me. Like I feel embodiment um, of the forces of nature, and not in a Disney World petting zoo kind of way. I mean the like churning, destroying blood and guts side of nature when I am backpacking in the backcountry and I haven't seen another person for days and I've been sleeping in the dirt and I am connected so intimately and overwhelmingly with the aliveness around me, right? And I think of that as an embodied experience, like this that I am a vessel or a channel that picks up and experiences those energies, maybe like how a tuning fork works. Um,
mm,
and I it's funny because I'm it's not often that I'm at a loss for words, but when I talk about these experiences, like no language that I know comes close to sort of explaining them. The closest I can get is through analogies, right? Like through this analogized language or comparison. Um, and like I see downloads and the divine present. I see it in sport for me. I talk tons about skiing. Like
Wow.
skiing is my spiritual practice, right? And I only say that half
Mm.
flippantly. Like I cannot tell you how many times what goes through my mind when I am skiing is that this is where God is. Like
Mm.
this sort of aliveness and presence and immediacy um, of being outside. And I think one of, not to go totally like off the ranch here, but I think one of the great parts of spiritual violence in our current moment is how dissociated and out of touch our environment makes us from these things, right? We are constantly distracted, and I think distraction, more than almost anything else, is a force of evil in our lives. It is the ultimate alienation from our true selves and from source or from God.
Mm. 100%. Yeah, I mean, what comes up for me is, I guess, like glimpses of a framework that I tend to use when I talk about my relationship with, yeah, like what you refer to as spiritual guides, or I think like what started out as relating to spiritual guides and then matured into relating directly to what I often refer to as my vaster self. And I really liked what you said about, yeah, like this tapestry and how threads relate to downloads and working with specific energies because yeah, I would say that like what's coming up for me right now is that like my sense is that we're basically like bodies within bodies, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
like I think like the languaging of like chakra systems to describe the subtle body, or the languaging of classical Chinese medicine and the intelligence or the chi of like different organs. I feel like it probably, I'll say like parallelizable to like one different like deity structures or different perspectives
Hmm.
of the intelligence of the body, which I think are, yeah, like spatializable or like spatially locatable within certain perspectives of the intelligence of the body, right? Because I think like space shows up in some
Hmm.
of the intelligence of the body and not in other parts of the intelligences of our body. Like there, you could say like perhaps more concretely that there are networks of intelligence within our bodies that don't understand
Yes,
space and don't understand time, and then there are clearly different networks of intelligence in our bodies which understand space and time differently from one another.
yes,
So I'd say, yeah, those threads for me relate to connections to those networks of intelligence. And then I'll say, like, maybe controversially, but maybe in a way that's not controversial at all to you, that they are localized within the perspective of the one that I'd say, like, we're communicating in right now as, like, planets and stars and galaxies. And, yeah, I'm curious what comes up for you when I, like, lay that in the container.
I want you to talk more about it. And I say that because I'm trying to understand, right? We are you are right now kind of I can feel myself like feeling around the edges of what you're saying, but I want you to say more.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Um, yeah, I guess like what comes up for me is like do you spend a lot of time in like astrology speaking circles?
No.
Okay,
Like
that's
to the
super
point where
interesting.
somebody asked me like what my Mars Capricorn thing was today, and I was like, I don't know what any of this means.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting to me, like how little like semantic distance and I guess yeah, like how much like inferential distance there are between these different fields, right? Because yeah, like astrology is nominally about planets, and so is like extraterrestrial discourse. But then it makes complete sense to me that um, like you wouldn't necessarily be like spanning those fields right now, right? But the reason I brought it up is because I think, at least in my experience of like astrological discourse, there's a decent amount of discussion about how humans become aware of celestial bodies when the collective consciousness of humanity is ready for them, right? Like, you know, like ready is in
Oh,
like, in,
fascinating.
yeah. And the reason I bring that up is because like there's a very like material way of thinking about that, right? Like becoming ready
Yes,
to
it's very like scientism, right? Like this is now legitimate. Yeah, like we have legitimized this thing or reified it. Yeah.
like there's like a like you know like a normatively epistemically sound way of thinking about that where it's like yeah becoming ready to apprehend Neptune relates to like developing the technology and scaling the technology up so that enough people can see it and verify that they're seeing the same thing at roughly the same time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then there's the more kind of like touchy-feely version of that where it's like, well, when we're ready to understand, um, yeah, like numinality, let's say, then we're ready to assign an archetype to this thing that we're ready to like interpersonally perceive technologically. And then we start talking about Neptune, and then we start using Neptune as an archetype in, I'll call it like the psychological exploration that is
Mm-hmm.
astrology.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I'm kind of, yeah, I'm like kind of like gesturing towards like this set of egregores, like on the periphery of this container, is that I would say that from my perspective, these celestial bodies are the way that humans, as a part of the intelligence of the envelope of space and time that we call Earth,
Mm.
that's the way that we
Mm.
apprehend certain deities.
Yes.
Then they
Yes.
have
Yes.
physicality within a mind in which like physicality lands in whatever way it lands for like me and you interpersonally, and then also like most people that we interact as quote separate minds in separate physical bodies unquote.
Yes. Right. Yes. Like they become lenses through which we can see much more, right? These archetypes.
And yeah, I'd say the same for like, you know, some people refer to Earth as a goddess, some people
Mm-hmm.
refer to Earth as a planet. And I feel like yeah, like they're basically like feeling around using different like sensory apparatus around like the
Yes.
same thing which is like outside of our consciousness and sort of well in the sense of Earth it's kind of like like Earth is getting a sense of herself through us as like the fingers of Earth in a very similar way I feel to like the way that I get a sense of my own epistemic foundations through the apprehension of your epistemic foundations and like the light of awareness that is shed onto like me through you, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, like we can't it is we look at these things obliquely, right? Obliquely and and through other lenses because direct observation is I don't want to say meaningless, but it is immaterial. Um it
Yeah, I'm just into that. Yeah.
it reminds me I've been reading about these ideas of hyper objects recently, right? Like this idea like UFOs I think are like the ultimate hyper object where they are like just to swing this right back to flying saucers, um, like that the subject itself or the idea of these cosmologies are so huge and so complex and exist in so many different spectrums of being and understanding that they cannot meaningfully be directly addressed. There has, like you can't to talk about to say something like UFOs are real is effectively a completely meaningless thing to say because the subject itself is so faceted and twisted in on itself and expansive that, like, of course UFOs are real or of course UFOs are not real. The assignment of real or not real is completely immaterial because the subject that we're even referencing is so vast and multidisciplinary, and outside of the disciplines too, that such assessments are basically meaningless. They don't mean anything.
Super interesting. Yeah, I completely agree. It's like, yeah, I mean, we're making them real by talking about them, and to the extent that talking about them is a way that different parts of the body of the one become aware of one another and their perspective of reality. And then, yeah, like it becomes part of the fabric of our reality, right? And I think maybe I'll
Hmm.
like sort of like take a little bit of a leap and say that like something I've said before is that I feel like if we all kind of like quote timeline jumped unquote, which I think
Hmm.
like it's common parlance maybe in like overlapping circles, but if we like timeline jump simultaneously as a collective, like planets might appear in the sky or like jump, because I feel like the physicality of like our universe is very concrete in current time within our universe,
Hmm.
and within like I'll say like the intelligibilizing capacities of our universe, but like from like the perspective of the body of the one, it's like an intelligence which is developing and which feels like incredibly malleable to me.
Yes, it is emergent. Like it's dynamic. It is not static. It is not dead. It is constantly churning, you know.
So, and I think like yeah, one of the hyper objects, I'll say to use your languaging, that has been on the periphery of this container for me is like the languaging of these phenomena itself,
Hmm. Sure.
and the role that that plays in like the physicalization of some of these hyper objects, right?
Yes.
Like I think like something that's been coming up a lot recently, at least like in my awareness, is like yeah, like the idea of like context, disclosure. I think like
Hmm.
around the time of the election, this was loudest due to like the channelings of somebody named Bashar, who I'm sure like you're familiar with, right?
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
but Bashar had said that, if the Democrats won the last election, 2024, we're talking about, depending on, yeah, just for people who might be listening to this in the distant future, the year 2000. um, the Bashar was basically saying that if the Democrats won the 2024 election, then it would lead to disclosure. If the Republicans won the 2024 election, then it would lead to World War III. And then I think there was a lot of conjecture around like whether we're already in World War III. But
Yes. And also whether or not
um,
we're already in disclosure too.
I mean, I think it was a really enigmatic, yeah, I'll say like entrance of uh, I'll say like gnosis in my field because of all of the things that we just talked about. But yeah, I feel like it's interesting that you were talking about like yeah, like first falling short of words, and then I'd say like gesturing at these things through analogy. And something that's been like really loud for me recently is the professionalization of like spiritual work or energy healing or spiritual science. And I'd say that like history would probably tell us, and definitely like a lot of people have like told me in often like in an unsolicited way, that we have to find like a common linguistic framework around what it means to do spiritual work, or we need like a common
Yes.
linguistic framework to discuss spiritual science.
We need a
And
Rosetta Stone, basically. A Rosetta Stone so we can translate between one thing and the other and it makes sense. So there's some fluency and continuity of understanding.
totally, because I feel like, yeah, like as I've gestured towards, and I feel like you're already aware that like people who are already tuned into, I'll say some of these like emanations of source don't need a Rosetta Stone, right? But a lot
Yes.
of those people became tuned into these emanations of source through experiences which don't, like the receptivity of these experiences for most people don't scale, right? Which is to say,
Yes.
like, people have to go through like what some lineages call like several dark nights of the soul. People have psychotic episodes. A lot of people don't make it. I think like in the
Oh,
history of spiritual exploration, like
oh my
I've
goodness.
spoken,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Like
I
people
have
jump off of,
I, I
like,
have I have so many thoughts on this. Oh my gosh, you're touching on
please,
one of my favorite subjects of strong opinions.
right,
Um, is
go for
so
it.
I think uh where do I start? So the first thing is I will say you will hear in ufology, you will hear the term disclosure bandied around very frequently. And disclosure is another one of those subjects that if you ask 20 different UFO people, you will get 20 different answers for disclosure. To some people, disclosure has already happened. The government has admitted that there is anomalous phenomena in our sky. To other people, disclosure will not have happened until there is an institutional reckoning of some kind, until the government itself categorically and fulsomely admits that we have contact with extraterrestrial beings, we have relationships with them, that um, you know that we are not the only intelligent life on this planet making decisions about its trajectory. And this, what you do see is you see these kinds of like broadcloth tapestries of ideas. You see everything from ancient alien ideas or Eric von Daniken's ideas of the chariots of the gods, where you had ancient astronauts who showed up and uh, guided the way for human development, and this tends to intersect and overlap with like stoned ape theory, where like Neanderthals ate a bunch of psilocybin and it made them smart, um, et cetera, et cetera. Like you do see in popular ufology, and when I say popular ufology, I mean not institutional academic style exploration of the subject. I mean, like in Tom DeLonge's books, the Secret Machines books, or in what you hear discussed on late night talk radio, or even on Twitter. Like you see almost this. I would, and I say this without judgment, this term, but you see almost this like primitive emergent religion, um, and it very much is a religion. It is not necessarily a spirituality. It is a religion because it comes with sort of these prescriptive dogmas and parameters. But one of the things that I think a lot about that you mentioned at the end of what you were saying is that we are living in this kind of post-truth era. Um, and to the extent that we ever really had like consensus truth and fact anyway, but our current moment, largely driven by these algorithmic machines that are we mainline 24/7 into our brains, um, have created these very niched kind of realities or truths in which people live. And these tools, which Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, whatever, they create these sort of um, this incredible spread of choose your own reality adventures. And some of this is good and some of this is bad. It's I don't think it is a useful practice, and maybe this is my dharmic obsession shining through, but I do not think it is a skillful practice to like assign good and bad value judgments to these things. But what I will say is I think that the population, capital T, capital P, in general, is not well equipped with the changes to their experienced reality. I think this shows up. I will not be surprised, and if somebody's listening to this 15 years in the future, please email me leahprime@proton.me to let me know how my prediction turned out. But I do think mass psychosis is basically an inevitable artifact of this kind of post-truth reality, where people basically are so poorly equipped to encounter the vacillations of truth or reality that it basically triggers them into being completely dissociated from reality or incapable of engaging meaningfully with complex or nuanced ideas. And the place I see this, I mean, I see this on the internet, right? Like the internet is like, in many respects, like it reduces down to this idea of cognitive security, right? Most people have incredibly poor cognitive security, and this is we could write reams about why and how that is and how to mitigate it or not to mitigate it. But we where I see this very frequently is really in the realm of popular psychedelic culture. And I bring this up because, psychedelics are their own thing, their own powerful tool. Just like spiritual emergence is its own thing and its own powerful tool or event. But we have seen the rise of psychedelic medicine over the last 5 years, and I think it's something that will increase. And I think that increase is less attributable to psychedelics and more attributable to psychedelics work at scale far better than our current paradigm of Zoloft plus therapist for 5 years and then get you back to being a productive computer toucher. Like psychedelics are basically an accelerant. But they're immensely powerful, and that, as that joke tweet goes, you can go get one-shotted by a 6D Mesoamerican demon by drinking ayahuasca. Like, similarly, I think that the nature of psychedelics does many people a vast disservice because people are so ill-equipped to actually integrate and make sense of what they experience. And I say this, my psychedelic experiences came much later in life. I was on the straight and narrow probably to like my mid to late 20s. And in hindsight, I'm very thankful about this. This is also why I'm thankful I didn't get real tattoos until my late 20s. So I didn't wind up with like some ridiculous, I don't know, only God can judge me bullshit on my bicep. I think it requires this degree of fluency and like frameworks to interpret and metabolize the psychedelic experience. And when I think about like my own encounters with psychedelia, is I had spent many years working with a Jungian analyst, and what I will say about this is the Jungian analyst was not very helpful for like my anxiety and depression, but he was incredibly helpful for like understanding myself and understanding all of the sort of complexities of human experience and the bigger picture kind of stuff. So this is, priceless in terms of, spiritual development and forming a foundation. But after going through a psychedelic experience, like my takeaways were like, one, this is incredibly powerful, and I have no idea how people use or engage with these tools in like chaotic settings. How do they go to music festivals and do this, or like how do they treat this like drinking a bunch of beer, right? And then also this feels catastrophically irresponsible to give people these experiences without also providing a robust net into which like that would not only catch them but allow them to make sense and integrate what has happened to them. And I think our collective failure to have and take seriously integration after monumental experiences is like one of the great failings of modern life. I mean, whether it's psychedelics or it is uh, living in an information society where we are constantly barraged with media, um, this sustained exposure or these one-off intense exposures in psychedelia, like these are deeply unnatural, and they also, and unnatural is not necessarily a bad thing, but unnatural also requires a constellation of additional resources to be valuable instead of degrading the human experience. And spiritually, I think this is very similar. And this is something, I would be remiss to talk about experience or phenomena in ufology without also saying, there is, I would say, a considerable amount of extraordinarily deleterious mental illness in ufology. And um, this is found in people that are extremely attached or cling to specific interpretations of what has happened to them or what they have experienced. Um, and I know before we were recording, I was saying about how excited I am to talk about UFOs with not UFO people, and I say this because, like, some of my favorite people to talk about ufology or downloads or encounters with non-human intelligence, some of the best people to talk about this subject with, frankly, I think are Buddhists. And I say that because the dedicated Buddhist practitioner has had all kinds of strange phenomena arise in their meditation session, in their practice, but they have also been divested from this compulsion to assign meaning or value to what they have experienced. So there's not this immediate compulsion to say it was an alien, it was a UFO, it was, the Pleiadians giving me information on the Galactic Federation. It is, yes, this is another phenomena that arises. Like, this is another thing that happens. And if you are present with reality and uh, truly present with it in whatever myriad form reality may take, um, there's all sorts of strange shit happening all the time. It's just we're not paying attention to it, and we live in little plastic bubbles and touch plastic constantly, and those are very effective force fields to the strange and unusual and great and terrible things around us.
So interesting that the ways in which you've been talking about touching computers and touching plastic, and I think it's like a recent phenomena that people are becoming more aware of and raising concern about
Hmm.
microplastics in their own bodies. And yeah, I feel like it's possible for people who are like tuning into those conversations to consider what it means for like us as parts of the divine body to be handling plastic in, as with as
Yeah.
handling microplastics within the divine body, so to speak. So like if we have concerns about what they're doing to us within our bodies, then maybe we can start to understand about how that concern manifests within the body of like our reality and the
Hmm.
realities outside of that. But yeah, I mean, I'm feeling really blessed by like what you just offered, because it feels like it has as much like informational abundance to me as like a thesis of some sort.
Yes.
I'm meditating on like what's coming through for me to say about it, and I feel like what's coming through for me to say about it is just like, yeah, I'm curious if like anybody else who is in the container right now has anything that's coming up for them, and you can like put it in the chat, or you can unmute if that feels aligned. I'll also say that while you were speaking, yeah, I'll call it in like a downloading state. And yeah, I'll say like, I don't know if you would call it energy work, but I felt like I was releasing karma around, um, yeah, I'll say like resentment around like having like conceptualized direct experience, like things that I can say about my understanding of reality, and not
Hmm.
necessarily feeling like I often get the opportunity to engage with other people who have like gnosis of that, I'll say quality. And I don't mean that in like the sense of some kind of like hierarchy, but I
Hmm.
mean it in the sense of like qualia, right? Like it has
Yeah.
like a tone, there's a feeling tone to it. And I feel like, um, yeah, having the opportunity to exchange gnosis in a conceptualized fashion with somebody like you has like, yeah, like I was saying, very well stocked shelves, and I'll even say like um, a very secure cognitive gun cabinet.
Yes, yes. You can't touch UFOs and conspiracy theories for 20 years and not wind up like one-shotted by Alex Jones unless you have a cognitive gun cabinet to keep the bullshit at bay.
100%. And yeah, I'd say this encounter is, I say that as a kind of like a meta fun. But I'd say the encounter has given me the opportunity to release some of that resentment because I feel like a lot of what you're talking about is an extremely high caliber within my own, I guess I'll say like Overton window when it comes to like
Hmm.
conceptualized methods. And my sense is also that um, you probably don't, it probably isn't like recognized, like literally recognized by like people who might benefit from recognizing it. Um, yeah, like how does that
Yeah.
land for you?
Yes. I mean, and I mean this in the least flippant way possible, but like to me it reduces down to ego attachment in a lot of
Mm,
respects, where at the that there is a drive to cling to particular stories or ideas because our identities become so subsumed and intertwined with them that to threaten these ideas or these conclusions is ultimately a threat to the self. Um,
mm,
and uh, I think what what I think, and this is me just kind of going off piece and just kind of riffing away, is I think ego detachment shows up in so many different ways, like that ego dissolution. It shows up in things like doing a thing that you did not think you were capable of, right? Like I think if you take someone who has never run and then they train for a marathon and they run the marathon, this is an ego dissolving event because
mm,
this is fundamentally and experientially challenged the stories and ideas that they had about their capacities. In we have ego detachment in psychedelia, right? Where you take a strip of acid and you're like, holy shit, perhaps my way of being and seeing is not the only way of being and seeing. But I think one of the most ego dissolving or disruptive experiences that is faced by the average person and is faced by everyone. This is a universal experience. Is the experience of grief. Um,
mm,
and grief shows up in so many ways. It shows up as loss. It shows up as death. It shows up as missed opportunities or opportunities bygone. And I bring this up because I think grief when I think about grief a lot in general, and I also think that the universality of grief is a door, and some people go through that door, and some people shut that door. Some people experience and encounter grief and look into the precipice and cling harder and faster to whatever cliff they're on. And some people get to grief and they realize that there is nobody coming to save them, that there is nothing that can come and rescue you from the deep, deep well of grief. But that's okay, right? Like it is okay that you are there by yourself. Or it is okay that you are experiencing this without anything else to hold on to. And I think um, I bring this up because I think that one, it is universal, and two, that opportunities to refactor our own stories and our own conclusions abound. There are opportunities with us everywhere and all over the place, and they show up in very small ways, and they show up in very, very large monumental ways. But the like what I think of, and not that there's like a good or right way to do spirituality, but I think of the spiritual practice as a meta system is one in which is dynamic and constantly evolving, and also constantly providing the person with an opportunity to confront and dismantle stories or truths that they may have previously held. Um, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about was because I am sure that you have encountered both yourself and in others people who have very intense spiritual experiences, like awakening experiences. What's your sense of how to deal with these or not to deal with them, or like what does basically the aftercare look like for encountering a monumental shift in spirituality, or in an encounter, right? An encounter with a non-human intelligence, or with an archetype, or with a god.
Mm. I mean, I feel like what's been happening has been fine. But
Hmm.
yeah, like we were saying, yeah, like people of all different lineages have been disintegrated by it. Literally, like people die, or people end up in situations where they end up, yeah, like they're out of communication with other people. And I guess I'll say like what's coming up are encounters which will require a different kind of aftercare. So
Hmm.
what I'm saying is like not necessarily like it's actually like necessarily not to be taken as advice about like what people could have or should have done in the
Yes. Oh
past.
yeah, of course.
I think that's really important because of like things which are related to what you were saying about in terms of ego detachment. Because I think many of our ancestors were able to get us into this reality because they had really heavy programming around like like retrospective programming, like self-programming. It's like something went well, how do we apply that going forward so we make more of that happen? Something didn't go well, how do we apply caution, like risk management, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? And I feel like if any of what I'm saying right now is integrated in that way, then it will actually like obstruct a lot of the encounters that people, I'll say, like need to have. But I feel like what comes up mostly for me is like the proliferation of concept tree and linguistic frameworks, which, like you said before, kind of like intersect in ways that allow people to hold these concepts in ways that don't destabilize them to the point of like individual psychosis or disconnection or excommunication from the rest of society,
Hmm.
such that people can have these experiences and either like feel completely like cognitively secure as they're having these experiences, or such that they can talk to people about these experiences using whatever
Yes.
language is
Yes.
available,
Yes.
and have those people that they speak to not be so massively shaken that they are, quote, triggered,
Yes.
unquote, into
Oh,
behaving
yeah.
that cause those people to feel cognitively insecure, right? Which is basically like TLDR, people need to listen to people. But I feel like
Yes.
there's this, the intelligence of the universe, and I feel like the way that you become an instrument of the intelligence of this universe is like similar to the way that I do. It's like the intelligence of this universe can like sense opportunities to enter into like the sub intelligence of, I'll say, like
Yes.
our frac safely, right? Because
Yes.
I kind of think about the way like many of us do energy work on ourselves, and it's just like we literally like feel into parts of our body, and we understand which parts of our body need our awareness at, or are able to handle our awareness at different times. And I feel like most of us reach a point in our path where, yeah, it's non-doctrinal. And I feel like that's really like what the awareness of the intelligence of the universe is doing with our sub-network of intelligence, is just sort of like feeling into different parts of our part of the body. And then I'd say
Mm-hmm.
like feeling into it in that way, yeah, like it promotes like cell growth, and it promotes like autophagy, and like
Mm-hmm.
the the composting of like I'll say like aberrational cellular material. And I think that speaks directly to what you were saying about grief in ways which I think are sufficiently coded.
Yes.
But
No, it does. It really does. Yeah.
and yeah, like that cell growth, I think creates like the substrate for like the cell growth which is to come, which I think looks cybernetic. Like it looks cybernetic
Mm-hmm.
within like our apprehension of reality now, and like how cybernetic lands within that apprehension. And I think it looks cybernetic to the body of the one from the perspective of the mind of the one, which is to say that like imagine if you could just like lie down in yoga nidra, and you could like change the way your body behaves, right? I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's where some of us are going, and I feel like we'll create the apparatus which allows us to get people like our fellow humans to the point where they can do that to themselves too. And it's like a massive leap from like where we are now. But you know, like I think some of what we were talking about before we started recording with regard to like artificial intelligence and like I'll say like machine learning, and like the kind of like synchronicity machine that our reality becomes,
Mm-hmm.
with those affordances like widely available on widely available devices. I feel like this is all kind of accelerating, yeah, collective human consciousness to a point where, yeah, we'll be able to see how, I'll call it like quote extraterrestrial intelligence unquote, is involved in the cultivating of our fractal of the universe through direct
Yes.
experiences ourselves of cultivating intelligence within our bodies, and it's not going to feel cognitively insecure to make contact with extraterrestrial intelligence when we understand the ways in which we cultivate intelligence and the physicality of our own bodies.
Yes. Oh man. Yes. I didn't want to interrupt you, but like as you were talking, I was like, yeah, yeah. Um,
I think, yeah, I had similar sensations as I was listening to myself talk. So, like,
yeah,
oh, that makes sense.
I mean one of the great to me one of the great opportunities with the AI age is the opportunity to engage with different a different kind of mind. and I say that very loosely, right? I say that without conferring consciousness onto ChatGPT, right? But I think that I largely think that it is a net good thing for people collectively and individually to be exposed to all kinds of different ways of seeing and of being. Um,
Mm,
and I do I it's when you were talking when we're talking about these big spiritual experiences, I think of my own experience. I am also a computer toucher now, and I being a computer toucher means you engage with people in like a very parameterized way, right? Like you have product meetings and you have investor meetings, and they're very particular kinds of tactical containers. I feel a bit of self-hatred, like appropriating spiritual language to talk about like ROI and KPIs, but whatever. Um, but I went to a Groff Institute holotropic breathwork retreat a couple years ago, and one of the main takeaways. These are fantastic programs, by the way. I'm not endorsed by them. I'm not a paid agent, but I will say like a holotropic breathwork retreat is incredibly powerful. And one of the things that struck me with is I'm in this room with like 13 other people who are also generally computer touchers or some therapists and stuff. Is
mm,
how rarely I and we encounter and engage with other humans having big, intense emotional and spiritual experiences. Um, and how sanitized we have been taught to be with our emotional and spiritual experiences, that they must fit very neatly within particular frameworks or parameters, and that when they fail to, they wind up pathologized, right? There is both a kind of social shame around having these big experiences or being too emotional or whatever. And then if you go too far in one direction, you know, you wind up pathologized and pumped full of benzos until you get stable. This is like, to be clear, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if this is saving someone from danger or harm, fine. But you know, I think having modalities for spiritual emergencies, which are a distinct and separate thing from spiritual emergence. An emergency is where there is this sort of fracturing that does not seem to be leading towards a recollectivization of the person, where this fracturing kind of continues and continues and continues. Um, and these are experiences, one, that are incredibly common. People experience spiritual emergency. Something between 15 and 20% of people will experience one at one point, some point in their life. And we have they are frequently pathologized. Groff, for all of the potential misgivings about some of his practices and ideas, Stanislav Grof did talk about the importance of basically holding people in these experiences in a safe container and letting them metabolize and go through it naturally. That like the generally the person will kind of reform on the other side of this without psychiatric or medical intervention. That basically, in other words, just having the space to let people have these experiences in and of itself is therapeutic and beneficial. Um, and two, um, we have, you know, by virtue of our highly technological and materialist reality or culture right now, we we have very few narratives culturally and socially to talk about these experiences. And again, this goes back to ufology, because when you talk to experiencers, they use X-Files language, right? They talk about UFOs and downloads, and they have this very kind of tech techno-informed vernacular to talk about ideas that in many mystical traditions have been around for a long time. These are ideas that have existed alongside not even ideas, these experiences have existed alongside human experience since time immemorial. Um, but we live in such a materialist language scape and culture scape that breaking out of these, having experiences outside the confines of that language makes them so difficult to discuss unless you have uh, experience with these lineages or traditions where you can talk about, chakra opening or jhana 2 or these more nuanced and sophisticated ways to identify and explain what you're experiencing, right? Like this is like if naming your feelings is like college work, like we're talking about postdoc work of being able to explain the complexity and intensity of these experiences and how they arise, and what they feel like, right? Like because these are not. I think the other thing with the sort of mind body dualism that we see in our present moment is that so much is bodily. So much of these emergent and emergency experiences are bodily. I mean, mine certainly was. My experience with emergence was um, very much an embodied experience. It was not to some degree, it was an emotional and cognitive experience, but it was overwhelmingly an embodied experience. And the embodied experience would be like if I were to map it to something, I would say it was ecstatic. It was like so intensely pleasurable that I was like, oh man, this is going to burn out my brain. Like this is going to burn out like whatever receptors in my brain are making me feel this, my body feel this good right now. Um, and I think that the embodied experience associated with these states is so frequently glossed over. Even and I mean, you hear it like in ufology, you hear this, but I think just in general, like in spirituality, you hear this. And I do think things are trending in the right direction where we talk more about embodiment. We understand the crossover between the mind and the body and their interrelationship and the bodily intelligence, right? That you've mentioned so frequently and so eloquently in this conversation. Um, it's something for me that's very exciting to see, um, and also something that I think ultimately, as people encounter this, it creates a more fulsome and integrated sense of self. It creates a mind body person that is more fulsome, more complete, um, and also more able and capable of holding expansive and intense states.
Yeah, what comes up for me is just, yeah, I'd say that when I'm interacting with the minds which occupy separate physical bodies within like this like spatialization and temporalization of reality that we call like physical reality, right? It's like I'm mostly interacting with selves which arise from awareness, which is
Hmm.
completely anchored in like conceptual realms or like
Yes.
logos. And I feel
Yeah.
like what you're we talk about like embodied intelligence is like, yeah, like you could say it's like a pri it's a pre-formal space, which I think, like intrepid bodies and I tend to refer to this as like namelessness. And I feel like
Hmm.
becoming
Hmm.
like in those realms, like in nameless realms, allows people to navigate different like different I'll say like logical partitions of reality, and I'm just sort of like cheekily referring to the computer science concept, but it allows us, I'd say, to navigate different logical partitions of realities
Yes.
or security. And I feel
Yes.
like that's where we will yeah, I think like we'll really kind of like I'll say like start entering into like a spiral towards a singularity, which is not completely bound by the computational affordances of silicon-based transistor-based substrates.
Yes, yes,
And I'm looking forward to it without attachment to exactly how it manifests in our reality.
yes, yes.
Um,
Very, very beautifully stated.
I'm feeling like this container is like more or less complete, and I guess the only thing I'd say is that several times, like during this container, I've had this like sensation of like the strings of my instrument like being plucked or like reverberating with energies which I wanted to sort of like bring into like the articulated material of this container, and then like moments after you would talk about exactly the thing that I was kind of feeling into. And yeah, I feel like at this point in the duration of the container, like every mode in the instrument of my vessel is being expressed, and I'm super
Yes,
grateful to
yes.
be
This
able to.
was, it, yeah. I was just gonna say this was very beautiful. It was very expansive, um, and there is, uh, for me, there is a very unique pleasure in talking to someone um, who one I'm so taken with your language and how you approach these ideas and how you explain them. It's both intuitive and uh, very poetic, but also there's a very unique pleasure for me in talking with someone who where I feel so much resonance, but also so much difference in a way of seeing, right? And to try to collaboratively work through and find the overlapping places on the map. Like that's incredibly gratifying for me. And I just want to say thank you so much for holding this container for us.
No, I mean, I feel very reflected in what you were just saying, because I feel um, yeah, I feel very much the same way. And I'll say only more that like coming from a mechanical and structural engineering background, I think resonance is often something which is to be held with caution. And I would
Hmm.
say, like, also coming from a musical background, resonance is something to be held like joyfully. And I think it's very rare that I get to hold resonance more in a sense of like joy versus caution. So I feel very cognitively secure in the container that we've formed together, including like the people who haven't come off of mute. And
Hmm.
yeah, I look forward to like what happens downstream of us having this discussion. And
Yes.
thank you so much. Peace. I'm going to say thank you for listening for people who are here live and also listening asynchronously. And I'll say you can see the description of this podcast episode wherever you're perceiving it for links to like our profiles on parasocial media. You can find links how to find the broom and how to support the broom, or how to become more involved in these discussions, hopefully live or asynchronously in text, because I feel like yeah, I think like the broom is like one node in a network which will be part of the formation of a safety net, which
Hmm.
allows more and more people to, yeah, I'll say like securely encounter things which are not yet part of our consensus physical reality. Is there anything you want to say before I stop the recording, Leah?
No, just thank you. I so appreciate the time and energy, both with yourself and the other attendees, and any future listeners.
Peace.